What's up everyone, this is Ryan here and you are watching episode 17 of my live stream Q&A. So I've decided to do something slightly different, which is that it's not quite 9 o'clock yet. But one thing I notice quite often is that for the first like 5 to 10 minutes of the stream, I'm usually a little bit slower in my talking and my brain hasn't quite warmed up 100%. So what I may or may not decide to keep doing is just kind of like babble for like 5 or so minutes about random nonsense, and then we'll get to the Q&A stuff. But yeah, so anyways, I see we got a couple of people. Welcome. God's Life for joining us, who's a regular viewer. Thank you so much. So yeah, what I'll do is I'll just briefly talk about this week and why the room database tutorial, video tutorial, has been such an enormously extended process. So back at the start of this month, I decided, hey, Google just released Room Persistence Library and Android Architecture Components. And I thought, hey, let's build a demo app and build a tutorial for it, and let's see what this thing is all about. And I was very, very curious about it and intrigued by it. And I'll actually talk quite a bit about it later on once the show really starts. But anyways, suffice to say, that was my initial plan, and I thought it would take me maybe 2 weeks or something like that to build the sample project, and then maybe another week to record it. And it's probably getting on to I think we're at week 4 now. And I was actually hoping to have it done last Tuesday, but last week just ended up being absolutely crazy for me, in the sense that so I work a full-time job, so generally speaking I only get maybe 2, or if I'm really trying to be really aesthetic and tough on myself, maybe 3 hours in the morning to sort of do this stuff. And anyways, this week was just ridiculous because I had an apartment viewing which started out really promising. It was initially, this might be kind of funny, so where I live, which is Victoria, BC, I was looking at a 3-bedroom apartment for $1,500 Canadian, which is roughly close to American dollars. It's something like 80%. But, and that's like a really good price here. If you can score a 3-bedroom apartment for $1,500, that's great. But anyways, I ended up going over and checking it out with the people I was potentially going to move in with. And the place was more like a 2.3 bedroom for $1,500. So all of a sudden, and also the rental people were super incompetent, and it just ended up falling through, but not without me wasting like 2 days on that. And then also my good friend, who's also my neighbor, fell over and shattered his elbow. So of course I'm gonna go check on him and make sure he's doing okay and all that kind of stuff. And it was just a really hectic week, and I just did not have time for stuff. And I see we are just about at 9 o'clock, so I will get started with the important stuff. So let's just check the chat really quick. You can absolutely use Model View Presenter pattern for a tab layout. Model View Presenter is really just a way of structuring your front end of your architecture, and there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to use a tab layout. That was just a quick question from Saroj, and I can expand on that later if you want. Anyways, let's get into the show. So this is episode 17. Thank you for joining me, and before we get to anything else, I just want to give my shoutouts to my Patreon patrons. So we have Christopher Sturm, Bassam Halal, Mr. Bidwell, Tony Jones Jr., Elad Stavi, Trevor Halvorsen, Nanotech, Sushil Chanda, and Shadow. So to all those people, thank you very much for supporting the show. If you're watching right now, if you would like to support what I do, you can either hit the like button down below, and you can also check out, I do have a Patreon and stuff like that. And yeah, that is my commercial for the day. As far as announcements are concerned, there's 2 things. Number one, the room database tutorial that I was complaining about earlier is finished. So the code is done, and it's on the repository, and if I'm not mistaken, it should be in the description box. If it isn't, then I have messed up a little bit. Tiny little description box. Let me just pull a link up to that. Let's see here. Room demo 2017. So the repository is done, and the video tutorial is about 50% done. Like I said, I had a really hellish week, and I just did not have the time to get as much work done as I wanted. So I'm just pasting this into the comments there, and also the description box, and that is the link to my room database repo, which I will talk about in one moment. So, what I have been doing for the past couple of episodes is I've basically been going through the 5 solid principles. So, so far we've been through the single responsibility principle. Let's see if I can remember them. The open-closed principle, the list cost substitution principle, the interface segregation principle. And then what I was originally going to do today was finish it off with the dependency inversion principle. And if you're wondering what the hell am I talking about, these principles are just, when you're building object-oriented systems, a whole bunch of really smart people got together and sort of created some principles, or I will use the word principle. They're not rules in the sense that you should never break them, because there will be scenarios where you must break them, but they're just kind of guidelines to follow. Now, I was originally planning to do the last one right now, but I didn't even have time to prepare for that. So instead of that, what I'll spend the first couple of minutes of this stream doing is just taking you through the Room demo project, and just talking about my experience with Room and what I think of it so far. And then we will jump into Q&A after that. So let's kind of get started here. So what I'll do just very briefly is I'm just going to talk sort of about the main 3 pieces of a Room database, and then I'll just talk about my experience kind of building this application, and then we'll jump into the Q&A, and that's basically it. So let me just rearrange things a little better here. Let's send you over to the right side. Move to right. There we go. Okay, so Room database. So basically the way that, or Room persistence library they like to call it, which is a fancier name. So if you, basically the repo I'm looking at is the one that's in the description box now, or the one I pasted in the comments. And it's basically just a fairly simple note-taking app which uses a Room database to manage the state of the application. And when you're building a Room database, it basically has 3 primary components that you need to work with. So the first component is called an entity. And basically I like to think of the entity as sort of a data model. Let me see if I can turn word wrap on here. Code, where is it? Completion. I can't remember where word wrap is. Oh, bloody hell. Whatever. Anyway, if someone in the chat knows where the hell soft word wrap is in the options menu of Android Studio, please do let me know. Anyways, so let's talk about, so this is an entity class. So entities are basically the models, the data models which your application will use, and also Room database will use. So like for example, by default, all I really need to do to create an entity for Room database is I just have to slap this entity annotation on. I do have to designate at least one primary key, and which happens to be like an item ID, and that's all I have to do out of the box. Out of the box. Oh god, that's all I have to do sort of out of the box. So the cool thing about that is that once I have that set up, Room is going to like automatically create a table called list item, and that is all the configuration I need to do for now. Now there's a lot more configuration you can do in a more complicated application, but that's the first thing. The next part of a Room database is this data access object, or DAO it's commonly called. So just really quickly in a nutshell, a DAO is basically it's a layer of abstraction between so in one end of your application, of course, you've got like Java and XML, but we'll just ignore XML because it's just layouts. So in one end of your application, you've got Java, and then at the other end of the data is the database, which is written in SQL, of course. So we have this data access object, which sort of acts as a layer of abstraction between the two. And what it pretty much does is it helps you go from sort of Java code and convert that into the SQL queries that you'll sort of need to work with the database. Now this is super cool because in order to do this stuff before, you had to fill out this enormous boilerplate file. So you, generally speaking, you wanted this big contract class with a whole bunch of SQL statements in it. You had to have like a SQLite open helper object and a SQL database object, and you needed to make sure you open and closed your cursors. You needed to make sure you open and closed the database. You needed to make sure it was a singleton, and just all this really frustrating, finicky stuff that was very poorly explained. And we've gone from there to this, which is friggin' beautiful. Let's look at the actual code, Ryan. So basically how this DAO thing works is for each sort of query you want to make on the database, you slap this query annotation down, and then I've chosen to return live data objects, which I won't get into that now, but that's super handy. And it just sort of executes your SQL. So we can say select from list item. What this is saying is select from list items, which is the table that's automatically generated based on annotating this thing as a list item. Excuse me. And then we pass in the item ID, and then through magic, this thing just automatically knows to sort of swap this item ID with whatever we passed in, thanks to the colon. And that's basically it. Then we just have to call this method on the data access object, which exists within the database object. But anyways, also there's a couple other things, like if we want to insert new items, all we have to do is type insert. We don't even have to type the SQL to do that, which is really handy. Same thing for delete. Now you can type more complicated SQL stuff if you want, but the thing that's just really cool is, like, for example, I'm not someone who's particularly interested in learning SQL. I just want to learn enough so that it works for the purposes of my Android applications and other applications. And so this is super, super handy for me. So the last piece that I'll talk about is the database class. Now I actually need to fix this up because I no longer use this method. I actually create the database through Dagger 2. But basically, the third piece of a Room database is just this database class. So you annotate it as so. You tell it which entities it has. So in this case, we only have list item, which we call an entity. And you list the version. So basically what the version does is if you change the underlying structure of the data or the schema, for example, if let's say I add another new random thing to my list item class, which is an entity, obviously I've now changed the underlying structure of this class, or of the schema of the database. And if I did that, I would need to then increment the version up to. Now it can get a lot more complicated when it comes to database migrations, but just if you do, that's kind of the basic gist of this, is that if you change the structure of your database and you don't want the user's data store of your app to get corrupted, you need to be aware of version changes and database migrations, but I won't talk about that. And the actual database class itself, it just extends room database, and it contains the data access objects that we want to access. And with these three things set up, which is not a lot of code, like we've got a very rudimentary model, we've got basically an interface with some annotations, and we've got an abstract class with like a single member variable. And through all of that, and of course setting up with Dagger 2, we have a working database more or less. It is of course more complicated than that with the view models and such, but as far as the database is concerned, that's that. So I think I've babbled for long enough, and let's get to some viewer questions after a really quick commercial break. Okay. So I'm going to ask Joshua, let's see. You know what? I'm going to assume what kind of pattern you're talking about. So the question, this is by Joshua. And the question is, this is a kind of a good general question to get started here. So I'm going to paraphrase a bit. Why do we need design patterns for development? That's a very, very good question, especially for beginners. What's up, Mr. Rainmaker? Thanks for joining me. So this is a really neat question. Why do we need design patterns for development? So very often, so I'm a major software architecture nerd. I really like software architecture. Actually, amusingly enough, what really got me into it was this book here. And I'm not paid to say this, but Design Patterns Explained. And it was an excellent, probably one of the most important books I've ever read on the topic of programming. However, I've only read like 2 books on the subject, but and of course it's called Design Patterns Explained. So I'm going to start this question by talking a little bit about what a design pattern is. And the easiest way for me to do that is to actually point you directly to one of my applications and use a practical example, because if we don't use practical examples, then I feel like a lot of this stuff we can use a whole bunch of words to describe what design patterns are, but I don't think that actually helps a lot of people. So why are all my windows on the left? Here we go. So just really, really quickly, I will show you a design pattern in my architecture. And we won't talk too much about how I set it up, but let's just talk about what it is. So first and foremost, well, just really briefly, this is the POS Trainer repository. You can find it down below. It's open source. And if I go to build.gradle, I just want to show you really quickly here that I've set up product flavors. We've got a mock product flavor and a prod product flavor. And why is that important with design patterns? What I can do, and if you're a beginner you might be wondering how, but just take my word for it. What I can do is once I've set up those flavors and build variants, then it's not going to let me do it for reasons I'm totally unaware. Are you serious? Like, okay, whatever. It's being annoying. It's not showing me my build variants, and that's frustrating. What I could do in theory, what I could do last time I opened this repository, is that I could switch between 2 different source sets. So what is that? I could switch between a fake database, and a real database. That's all I mean. And the way that I can do that is through applying a design pattern. what is that design pattern? Really, really simply, I want you to just notice this. So I'm going to open up alarm detail presenter test, and I'm going to open up alarm detail presenter. You'll notice that this has the name presenter because it's using model view presenter. Now, let's try that again. Now, the important thing here is that, so this presenter object depends upon use cases. Or, crap, I totally chose the wrong example here. I keep forgetting that this thing is clean. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, so in the tests, you know what? Let's just explain it like this. This will be a little bit easier because I feel like you're a beginner and I feel like I'm getting way too complicated and not really answering your question very well. So, are you serious? There we go. Okay, so what exactly is a design pattern? What are design patterns? What do they actually do for you? And then I'll explain why they're important. So when you build object-oriented systems, which are basically all the systems you will be building if you're an Android developer, there is a resurgence of sort of, some people call it functional, some people call it reactive, but we won't go there. But basically, this is the architecture diagram. This is the architecture of my POS Trainer repository. Like just really, really quickly for beginners, I have a data layer, I have a use case layer, and I have sort of front-end layers or features of the application. And that is reflected exactly in this picture. This is the front end, so this front part here, separated by this line, is responsible mostly for drawing things on the screen and user interactions. We won't talk about the use case layer because that's clean architecture and it's super complicated. Let's pretend this layer doesn't exist. But rather down here we have like a data layer. So what I'm trying to say, and the important takeaway here, is you're asking why are design patterns important, and partly like what are they? Essentially what they are, and this is really like the most important thing to take away here, is that when you're building these systems, if you build them certain ways, you will create systems which are easy to change, easy to test, and really easy to just scalable, easier to build over time. And that's super important because in basically every project you'll work on, your requirements will change. So design patterns start to arise when you build systems, when you build your applications in intelligent ways. And one of those intelligent ways, for example, is for each of these different, I closed the friggin', sorry. For each parts of an application, so whether it's the front end layer or the use case layer or the what the hell is going on with my thing? There we go. Or the service layer. These things depend upon each other through abstractions. So you're probably wondering again, like, what the hell am I talking about? Why is that important? What I would suggest you do is I have a playlist called Solid Principles, and I would suggest you check that out because I introduce you into design patterns and concepts from object-oriented architecture design, and through that I think you'll start to see why this stuff is important. In a nutshell, it's a very broad topic, but in a nutshell, if you build things following design patterns, your applications become easier to build, easier to design, easier to test, and easier to change. And that's why you want to use design patterns. I know I did a horrible job explaining what they are, and I do apologize about that, but hey, sometimes My explanations suck. Anyways, let's move on to a new question. Mr. Rainmaker is asking about fonts. I haven't really messed with them very much, other than just setting a font family. Like you're asking about. I'm not sure if this is actually the question you're asking, but for example, whenever I want to set up fonts in my application, what I do is, and you're probably already aware of this, but I just, for example, for buttons and text views and all those kinds of things, all I do is set this font family attribute. And it's giving me an error that the current API minimum is 1, and that is very, very bizarre, and might explain why my build variants weren't working earlier. That is very weird. Huh. Interesting. Well, I'll have to fiddle around with that later, because that doesn't even make sense to me, but that's fine. So, any more questions? What have we got here? So this is Shantanu has a question. Shantanu asks, can you suggest some projects? I have to build one for college. All right. So I can certainly suggest some projects for you. Here are my main projects that I suggest to people who ask this question, because it is a really important question. What do I build for practice and learning? So my best suggestion would be to build. The general suggestion I give people is build a note-taking app. So why do we suggest a note-taking? Why do I suggest a note-taking app? The reason why is it demonstrates in a simple way most things you'll need to do in an enterprise kind of app. And what I mean by that is it needs a database, it needs a data store, so it needs to store data. It should work with that data asynchronously. That's a fun one to spell. It should work with that data asynchronously, and it gives you a chance to really think about UI and UX, because it's a very user-driven application. I mean, they all are, but it's a good general project to pick. Now, another good project you could pick is a calculator. These are all my general suggestions. The calculator is great because it demonstrates a complex UI, but it's also simple to build as it generally a single activity. And the main reason why I suggest these two projects is that you're going to find a lot of examples that you can base your project on, and that is really key. And when I mean examples, I mean open source code repositories, because I really don't think there's anything better than having some open source code written by a good developer open beside you as you're building something like this, because then you can kind of see, oh, they do it like that. Well, why? And then you maybe implement it, and then you're like, oh, okay, I see they do it this way. They use this design pattern, and that solves this problem. And it's a very organic way to learn. So that's basically, those would be my two main suggestions. And the thing about the note-taking app is you can play around with it. Like, you could do like a my first app was a workout log, which is basically still a note-taking app. Fundamentally, my favorite choice is the note-taking app, and the reason why is you have to be able to store data in almost any application that you'll work with. And so it gives you the chance to build a front end and a back end, and that's really, really important. So that would be my suggestions for projects. Okay. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Mr. Rainmaker is asking about setting custom fonts with dynamically generated objects, and I've never, like, I don't, yeah, I'm not entirely sure how you would do that so that you don't have to set them. I think like the question is appears to be how do you, yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Like how do you set a typeface for dynamically created views? Because apparently if you set font family, well, so when you're inflating your objects, isn't there some way within Layout Inflator that you can include like an attribute set? Like maybe you could actually inflate it with styles? Like I feel like that should be possible, but I've never really done that per se. Well, kind of waiting on questions here. I do have a question that someone asked in the Slack channel, so I could potentially get to that. But anyways, let's see here. Or I could start rambling about room database more. I could talk about live data. All right, well, I'm not getting any questions, so let's talk about live data and how annoying it was to create. Actually, we can just kind of generally talk about the Dagger 2 implementation and live data and all that kind of stuff. So let's talk about live data for a little while and Viewmodel. So how I've decided to build the room demo application is, so of course I still do like a, sorry. Apparently it's easier to work with fonts in O, but for now it's pretty annoying to work with. Anyways, so let's talk about Viewmodel and live data and stuff like that. So for each feature of this application, I've created a Viewmodel object, and we're kind of following model view, Viewmodel, of course. So if I open up, for example, the create fragment, you'll see that it depends upon a Viewmodel factory, and also it has this new list item Viewmodel object. So basically how this works is when I create the fragment, and that of course happens in the activity, so we create the fragment, through Dagger 2 I inject a Viewmodel factory. Why would I need to do that? Well, it turns out that let's have a look at new list item Viewmodel. For example, it turns out that if you want to, for example, inject a repository into a Viewmodel through constructor injection, you need to kind of fiddle around with it and use the where is it? So you need to use the constructor or builder for viewmodelproviders.of, which includes a Viewmodel factory. Apparently I forgot to answer Saroj's question. Well, no, I answered it right at the start. You can use model view. Like model view presenter is one of several ways to build applications. Like it's so maybe I can go into more detail if you like, but to answer your question, yes, you like Model View Presenter is one of several ways to structure the front end of your application. So you can really do just anything you want with it. Let me address that later. Anyways, so how this view model thing kind of works is in order to be able to use dependency injection, I actually inject this view model factory object into the fragment, and then I create the view model within the fragment with the view model factory, which comes from Dagger 2. Now, as far as my Dagger 2 implementation is concerned, it's really, really basic, deliberately. I just have this application component and application module and a room module. And so what room module does is it sets up all of the crap that I need. So it sets up the list item DAO, it sets up the repository, it sets up this view model factory, and all of this wiring is necessary to kind of decouple things properly. And the reason why is that this list item repository object, which I pass into the view model, where is it? Needs to have the DAO injected into it. And so I found this really, really cool because the nice thing about this is that our repository object is not depending sort of directly upon the database. It's just depending upon this data access object. And that really simplifies the code within my repository. So another bonus for Room Database is how easy this stuff is to set up. Anyways, let's see if we can get to some more questions here. Okay. So what I'm going to do, I see we've got a question from Mr. Rainmaker. I'll get to that next. So I want to revisit this Model View Presenter question because, okay, so I'm going to kind of expand upon this. Okay, so Saroj asks, what was it? Can we use MVP for a tab layout? And the reason why I want to kind of talk about this, and Saroj, I mean you absolutely no disrespect here. I'm just trying to explain it a little bit better. So I get the feeling that you're not 100% clear on what Model View Presenter actually is. In practice, maybe you kind of conceptually know what it is, but so like in general, just really quickly, so the view, and this is how I define Model View Presenter. So the view receives user input and draws stuff on the screen, UI, and UI interactions in a nutshell. The presenter coordinates and communicates between the view and the model, makes decisions, logic, based on such input and events. And then of course we have the model, and the model basically, see, this is the big confusing part that is kind of poorly defined, but so in one definition, a data model is just there's so many different words for it, it's annoying, but for example, a POJO, like a list item. Like some people, in some definitions, this is a model. It just models some data. However, the sort of how a lot of people more generally describe it is the model is like the data layer of the application. The thing about that, like at the end of the day, how is that, is a database really that different from a single Java data module? Because they're both responsible just for saving data in a sense. They just do it in different ways. But we'll just say model is the data. So, so that's basically what Model View Presenter is. Now I can apply Model View Presenter in any user interface of which uses any kind of views that I want. So let me take you through this room demo, one of the activities here, and this will be hopefully demonstrate my point fairly well. So let's go to create. Wait, this thing's Model View View Model, so that's kind of a crappy example, Ryan. I'll try and get through this friggin' buggy thing. So let's go to Fragment. Let's go to Fragment Alarm Detail. So as a quick example, one thing I will do very commonly is to get back to the question the question is, can we use Model View Presenter for a tab layout? Well, you can, as I said, you can use Model View Presenter for anything. It's like someone snuck into my POS Trainer repository and fucked it up while I was away or something, because it's just not loading properly, which is very bizarre. Pardon my language. That is really weird. Anyways, to get to the point without the visual example, because it's not loading, so let's say we have a toolbar, and you might be wondering, like, how can I do Model View Presenter if my toolbar exists in the activity and you have to set the toolbar in the activity, but I also have a fragment, so now I kind of have two views but only one presenter and stuff of that nature. I solved that problem by putting all of my UI in the fragment. So for example, we have this fragment which has what I kind of call a fake toolbar, which is just image buttons of the same size and dimensions of the standard Android toolbar if you want to set it, except I do it myself. And then what the actual Java code looks like is, we'll open up Fragment Alarm Detail Fragment. And this is, of course, the view. You can even, the interface it implements is view. And so what that means is that, and this is what Model View Presenter really means, is that you're going to have certain classes in your application which have the responsibility of being a view or a presenter or a model. Generally, like for example with the presenter, I will call it exactly that, although the fragment just implements the view. It's sort of an abstraction. It talks to the presenter through an abstraction, which is another discussion. But yeah, that's basically it. So this class is now responsible for being the view, and I don't really let it do anything else. But the point I'm trying to get at here is it doesn't matter what I put in the view. Like I could slap in a tab layout, if that's the question you're kind of wondering. I could easily include a tab layout here, and that's not going to, this thing is still going to be a view. So you're still going to be using Model View Presenter. How Model View Presenter kind of works, of course, is that we have our view, which is a fragment, and it talks to a presenter, which in this case is Alarm Detail Presenter, which is here. And Alarm Detail Presenter, again, this is clean architecture, so it's another level, but ignoring the use cases, this class, the presenter, will then talk to the data. Just think of this stuff as data, a way to access data. And that's basically all that Model View Presenter is. Like, it's not, yeah, it's not anything else, I would say. Anyways. Okay, so using MVP will make a view for a certain period until the data is retrieved. How can we solve that if the tab layout will load a next fragment? I'm not really, I'm trying to understand your question. So if you've got like multiple fragments and you're using Model View Presenter, well, so in that case, like, here's the thing. It appears what you're asking now is like, okay, if you have an activity with multiple fragments, how do you manage Model View Presenter within that context? So the thing about that is I don't generally make activities with multiple views because I really like to observe the single responsibility principle. Now you're asking with the tab layout specifically, and assume probably you're using the tab layout with a view pager with fragments in it or something like that. As far as the tab layout is concerned, I've actually solved that problem before by faking the tab layout and actually only having it in one single fragment to begin with, and then just updating a recycler view. So let me see if I can pull up a quick example of that. Where is it? Like, I get what you're saying now. It's just that I still solve this problem by basically almost faking the user interface. But when I say faking, if it looks the same and it functions the same, it's not really faking. But this thing's just going to take a little while to load. All right, so I'm just going to really quickly pull some classes up in this repo, and then I'll open it up here. Okay, so to kind of answer your question, so how do we set up like tab layouts in Model View Presenter? The way that I handle that is actually by, this is another project. It's not really open source, but I can reference it and use it as an example. So basically, what I do is, of course, we have the tab layout and I add tabs to it. And all I really do is, you'll have to forgive me, it's been a while since I've looked at this code, but so I've got my recycler view within this thing, and we've got the tabs. And when a tab is selected, all I really do is I tell the presenter, hey, this particular tab was clicked. So let's open up the presenter. And so within the presenter, it, again, like to go over what I said earlier, things haven't really changed all that much, except that I still only have one view because I've deliberately not had several views within one activity because it works really well, in my opinion. But all I do is I do animate and change the tab layout based on what the presenter says, and then I just change the data set of the underlying recycler view. So basically what I'm getting at here is, so if you want to have multiple views and fragments in one activity, you can do that. It's just you're probably going to need like maybe a larger presenter that talks to the smaller ones or whatever, or you can build apps like I do and just avoid that situation. So hopefully that kind of answers your question, but in a nutshell, how I would handle a tab layout, how I handled a tab layout based on this code is that I actually didn't use the fragment pager adapter, because in this case all I was doing was all I had to do is just change this data set of a recycler view. I didn't actually have to create a new fragment. So most people looking at that would assume I was using like the fragment pager adapter or something, but nope. Anyways. All right. So presenter caching, let's see here. So I'll talk a little bit about presenter caching. My stream, hopefully we're still live here. Oh yeah, accidentally opened up Spotify. Okay, so just a really quick one. Ravi is asking, so he's worked on some Volley apps, some social networking APIs, and some basic stuff. Is that enough for an entry-level job? Absolutely. You're probably going to want to check out my roadmap for junior developers series, because that'll probably answer some questions that you have. My computer is churning right now, but hopefully we're still recording. So anyways. Orientation changes. Let's see here. I'm just going to have to open up Pause Trainer. It's going to lag for a minute. Okay, so let's have a look at the presenters. So for I don't have an excellent answer for you, unfortunately, Mr. Rainmaker, because how I currently handle orientation changes is all I really do is I set retain instance state to true in the fragments themselves, so that those fragment instances are maintained when the orientation of the application. Just one more time, let's try that again, Ryan. So all I do is I set retain instance on the fragment, and so I've actually hooked up the logger or the debugger and checked this, but basically what that does is when I change the orientation of the phone, of course, it means that the presenter state and instance is not destroyed. However, its view, its UI does have to get recreated. What that means very specifically is that onCreate does not get called again, but onCreateView does get called again and all that stuff. So the effect of that, what I have observed is that that is basically because my presenter and the rest of my app is sort of decoupled from the activity. Essentially, that makes those parts of the applications sort of somewhat irrelevant to the orientation changes. Now, is this an ideal way to handle state on orientation changes? Not necessarily. I'm still working on solving that problem, but I found this works as a general purpose thing. One of the issues that actually my friend Derel was mentioning is that apparently you can't actually always trust set retain instance to work properly, and it might actually have some issues with it. But for now, that is kind of how I solve it. But for example, we've got the lifecycle owner and manager and all that stuff in architecture components, and I'm going to be working with that and live data and those things probably a lot more in my applications. It's just that I haven't done that a lot, so I can't really point to the code and be like, hey, this is what I do. But hopefully that somewhat answers your question. Really, to answer your question, I don't have a great way of doing it right now, but I have a quick way that works. All right. Let's do two more quick. I'm going to do two quick questions. So this is, I can answer this one quite quickly. It's not as interesting of an answer as you might think, but Saroj asks again, what is the difference between MVP and MVVM? So I'll show you a couple of visual examples, and this is kind of an amusing thing because the difference is actually quite minimal. Now, I really hope that Windows Photo Viewer will let me have two photos open at the same time, but I don't. Oh, it actually will. Okay, that's good. Okay, so of course I babbled on and on about Model View Presenter. This is like clean architecture, which is why it's got this domain layer, but let's just focus in on the Model View Presenter part, which is right here. And so what exactly, this is the difference between Model View, View Model, and Model View Presenter. This is all the difference. In Model View Presenter, we have a presenter which has reference to a view, so it depends on a view, and we have a view which depends on a presenter. And then of course we've got like the model of the data, but that's somewhat irrelevant for the actual difference of this thing. So we've got a presenter which has reference, or it depends upon the view. The only real difference between that pattern and Model View View Model, which is this pattern here, is that in this case, if you Model View Presenter would just be, if we change that to presenter, this text here, and then we drew an arrow such that it points to the fragment. That would be Model View Presenter. The only friggin' difference is that in Model View View Model, how it works is the view model may not have reference. It may not depend upon a view. It can't have an arrow here. Now you might ask the question, well, how does it communicate back to the fragment then? The fragment can talk to the view model, but the view model can't talk to the fragment or the view. Really, what it has to do is it actually just publishes data to some kind of, it just publishes data. It becomes, if you're familiar with RxJava, it basically employs the observer pattern. So what happens is the fragment observes some data which the view model is responsible for fetching. And so whereas in Model View Presenter, the presenter would like ask the repository for data, and then it would say, hey view, here is your data. Instead, it asks the repository for data, and then it sort of publishes it. And then the fragment is listening through an observer. The fragment is the observer, and it listens for that data. Now, obviously, you need some kind of framework to be able to do this. If you check out my room demo, the way that I do this is just really, really quickly. So we've got our create fragment. So I'll just call it a view. So as you can see, our view depends upon a view model. It has a line. Let's get rid of Model View Presenter. So our view has a line to the view model. That's just a dependency. Okay, and then when I open up that view model, where is it? New list item view model, you'll notice it does not have a line to the view. There's no dependency on the view. It does have a line to the repository. And the way that it actually tells, the way that it gets wired up is that in the fragment, the view, we use this method. We say we get the view model, and then somewhere at some point we listen to it. Where is it? Where do I set up the observer? Oh, you know, I picked a crappy example because this one doesn't actually need to observe the data set. Let's go to list item, where is it? Item detail, that's a better example. So all that stuff I just said, except in this case, the view does need to listen. And the way that we set that up, really what I'm just saying is the way that we set this relationship up here is by live data, which is an observable kind of thing. And so our view observes by way of calling this code. We say, hey, get me the view model, and then observe this part of the view model. We want to observe some list item. And then this is how that thing kind of gets set up. So just to summarize the question, what is the difference between Model View Presenter and Model View View Model? All it is that the view model, at the most fundamental level, is that the view model is not allowed to talk directly to the fragment. It has to talk to it through indirect means, which is in Android now with Android architecture components best achieved, I would say, through live data or RxJava. So your fragment becomes an observer of the view model, but the view model cannot talk to the fragment, and that's really all model view model is. So, hopefully that answers your question. So Ravi is asking if I can give some practical examples of test-driven development, and holy crap, do I have the video for you. You're going to want to check out my channel, and let me find the video, because it is like 2 hours of exactly what you're asking for. It's this, one of the videos I'm quite proud of. I'm not proud of a decent amount of my videos, but this one was really good, so let me find it. Can't remember exactly where it was. Here it is. All right, so your question was, where is it? So the question was, yeah, I lost it. Oh, here we go. So Ravi asked, can I give some practical examples of test-driven development? And I'm typing a video link in the comment section, Ravi. And what this video is it's 2 hours of me applying test-driven development, live building an application. And so I would highly suggest you check it out, because it is like hours of footage of what you just asked for, basically. So I'm only going to answer like one more question, and that'll be it for today. Some chat going on. All right, well, I'm going to give 1 or 2 minutes. Oh, the last question I was going to answer was by Pori Hacker, which was, what is Dagger 2? So I try not to answer this question, because it's friggin' impossible to answer quickly, but I'm going to try and, once again, to give like a general explanation of what Dagger 2 is. So, Pori Hacker, I'm going to paraphrase him a little bit, but basically it's like, he or she didn't actually write this, but what the fuck even is Dagger 2? Like, people, I understand where you're coming from here. Like, when I first heard of Dagger 2 in the start of 2016, and I had started working with 2016? No, the end of 2016. And then I really started implementing it in this year. And when I started it, everyone was talking about it, and everyone was talking dependency injection. And I was like, well, what the hell is dependency injection, and what the hell is Dagger 2? So first things first, here's what dependency injection is. So let's just say class sum. This is kind of funny. This is a funny realization when you actually realize that dependency injection is like the most simplest concept ever. So class sum class, we're just going to call it. So we've got sum class. It has a constructor, public sum class. And let me do this in Android Studio. That would be a lot smarter. All right, I'm just going to fiddle around here. All right, so class sum class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain it in principle, but I'm not going to explain how to set it up, because how to set up Dagger 2 is really friggin' complicated, but what it actually does isn't so complicated. So let's just say private some. Sorry, my roommate is making a bunch of noise. So private sum dependency, doesn't matter what it is, and then we have our constructor. So public sum class. All right, so this is without DI, without dependency injection. In that case, we would say sum dependency equals new sum dependency, or yeah, sum dependency. It's not going to create it because I haven't actually created that class. Okay. And then all I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy and paste this with DI. Some dependency. And then we say this dot dependency equals some dependency. And this is dependency injection. This is all you need to wrap your head around for dependency injection. What do I mean? In order for this to be dependency injection, some class, a given class, doesn't matter what it is, if it isn't using dependency injection, it creates its own dependencies. If it's using dependency injection, some external class gives it the dependencies. And that is dependency injection. Like, are we all clear? The only difference here is that without dependency injection, some class creates its own dependencies. With dependency injection, some class does not. It gets given through, and this could be through parameters. It could be like through an annotation, like with Dagger. So that's all you need to know about dependency injection. As far as what Dagger 2 is, it is a framework which allows you to achieve dependency injection. And I'm not really going to talk about what it actually does because that part gets really complicated and I'm tired of talking for today. But just really in a nutshell, we slap these annotations on things, and you can either put an annotation inject on a variable like this, or you can put it on a constructor like in my model view presenter setup. In the presenter, I actually annotate the constructor. And basically what I do is I slap this annotation on here, I say inject, and then if my Dagger 2 stuff is set up properly, all of these things specifically, will get created through Dagger 2. So that's basically it. And hopefully that was, I know that episode was all over the place, but I've got to call it a day for today because I have a whole bunch of work to do. I need to finish off that room database tutorial. So thank you so much for watching, and peace out.